Welcome back. Good afternoon. Today we're going to start a new reading, The Life of Jehoshua, the Prophet of Nazareth, an occult study and a key to the Bible containing the history of an initiate, by Dr. Franz Hartmann. Little bit about Franz Hartmann. Franz Hartmann was of the same Rosicrucian lineage as Rudolf Steiner. It is speculated, and shouldn't just say speculated because there's evidence to that. There's a book written by a guy named Samuel Robinson, and he's done a lot of research on Rudolf Steiner and Max Heindel and their origins and whatnot, as well as Franz Hartmann. Dr. Hartmann was both praised by Manly P. Hall and criticized by Manly P. Hall. He was praised in his scholarly pursuits and his deep knowledge of the subject. So there's no question there that he's incredibly knowledgeable. It was just later on in his career, I think when he was kind of broke and destitute, that he put together a book called, I think it was called The Symbols of the Rosicrucians or something like that, and another little smaller book called With the Adepts or something of that nature. And Hall had criticized him by saying that he gave kind of a fictional account of how this knowledge came to him to make it more mystical sounding. I mean, you find this actually quite a bit in the writings of mystics. They're always talking to, some ascended master or, whatever the case may be. It's not that uncommon, but that was just one criticism that Hall had of Hartmann in his later years, because he thought that maybe in his time of struggle he was just kind of putting things together so he could survive, basically. And in doing so, he kind of sold himself out in not being as, honest as one should be, I guess. But he doesn't discredit the man's knowledge and his vast body of scholarship. I think he said he threw a couple symbols in his book that maybe weren't of genuine origin or something to that nature, but it was still alchemical artwork. So just take that for what it's worth. Kind of a minor note, but still important. So let's get going with the preface. The only object of the following pages is to aid in dispelling the mists which, for many centuries, have been gathered around the person of the supposed founder of Christianity, and which have prevented mankind from obtaining a clear view of the true Redeemer, who is not to be found in history nor in external forms, but who can only be found within the interior temple of the soul by him in whom his presence becomes manifest. It must be left to the intelligent reader to decide whether the accounts given in this book may be accepted literally as historical facts, or whether they are intended to represent eternal and ever-occurring processes going on within the inner consciousness of man. The only key to the understanding of the truth is the power to perceive it, for the truth teaches itself, not by the light of argumentation, but by its own light, and it teaches nothing else but itself. All that the reading of books can possibly accomplish is to aid us in bringing the truth which exists within ourselves to our own understanding, and to drive away the clouds of erroneous conceptions which may keep us from knowing ourselves. There is nothing to prevent man from rising into the higher regions of thought where the light of truth exists, except his clinging to erroneous opinions. There is no way of driving away the darkness except by the diffusion of light. And that's the preface. Here's a list of the contents, and we'll get going here on chapter 1. There's a little dedication, kind of like a prayer, but we're going to just get right to chapter 1 here. I guess we're going to get to the introduction. All right. Ever since the beginning of the Christian era, a storm of varied opinions in regard to the supposed founder of what is called Christianity has been raging in the world of mind, finding its expression on the external plane in deeds of violence, in innumerable cruelties, wars, atrocities, and crimes, such as are almost beyond the power of human imagination to conceive. From the time of the maniac emperors, when the Roman arenas were reddened with the blood of the Nazarenes, down to the Middle Ages, when Christians had ceased to be persecuted and became persecutors in their turn, when the scum of all Europe pillaged and plundered the inhabitants of the Holy Land in the assumed name of Christ, down to comparatively modern times, when the skies of all European countries were blackened by the smoke ascending from burning faggots. And no, we're not talking about homosexuals there. We're talking about a bundle of sticks, upon which men, women, and children, suspected of heresy, were roasted to death by those who claimed to be followers of him, who had taught the doctrine of universal fraternal love, and still further down to our present time, in which the churches struggle to regain their waning powers and wealth. The cause of all religious warfare has always been a difference of opinion in regard to the nature of Christ. While the most fanatical adherents of orthodox theology, entirely ignoring the religious histories of the world, with its Manus, avatars, Buddhas, and saviors of mankind, such are said to have appeared upon the globe millions of years before the advent of modern Christianity, regard the person of him who is called the Christ as being the only begotten Son of an extra-cosmic creator of the world, conceived in some miraculous manner by a virgin of Palestine, and while they thus apply the most gross and sensual exoteric explanation to a beautiful ancient myth, which hides a sublime and eternal truth, the modern critic either denies that such a person as the Jesus of Nazareth of the Gospels ever existed, or he sees in him merely a man of extraordinary talents, a hero who dared to proclaim what seemed to him to be the truth, a religious reformer who died, like many others, for the promulgation of a grand but impracticable idea. Some of these critics are very profound thinkers, but they have evidently not looked behind the veil that divides the eternal, ideal, but nevertheless real world from the sensual world of illusions wherein we live. They were unacquainted with the constitution of the spiritual organism of man, and they could only see the mortal part of Jehoshua, while their opinions in regard to his spiritual nature were based upon speculations which may have approached the truth in proportion as they followed their highest intuitions. Thus Kant regarded him as the ideal of human perfection, John Stuart Mill as a very extraordinary man, Lord Amberley as an iconoclastic idealist, Fichte as the first teacher who revealed the unity of man with the Supreme Spirit, Hegel as an incarnation of the Logos, Schelling as a kind of avatar, i.e., one of the periodical descendants of divinity, Dr. Keim as a mysterious man who glorified spirit inspired his disciples to attempt the reformation of the world. Strauss looks upon him as a moral reformer who occasionally stooped to imposture to secure the confidence of his adherents. Renan as an effeminate idealist, an impostor who performed bogus phenomena. Schleiermacher as a man in whom self-consciousness was so saturated with the divine principle that he really became a God incarnate. Anatoly Bembe as a modern anarchist and socialist of the most fiery kind, and Gerald Massey, who bases his opinions upon historical researches, finds that Yehoshua ben Pandira was born some 120 years before the Christian era, and that the typical Christ of the Gospels was made up from the features of various gods. It appears that those who have attempted to disprove the existence of a historical personal Savior of mankind have done no serious harm to the interest of religion, because the pious mind intuitively feels that the gospel accounts attributed to the four evangelists contain, after all, a great deal of truth, even if the events which are told therein have never occurred in history. But those who attempt to base the whole foundation of their religious conviction upon the existence of an historical Jesus, and ask others to do likewise, may be doing serious harm. For the belief in an historical Jesus can, after all, be merely a matter of opinion, and a faith based merely upon a possibly fallacious opinion, having no knowledge for its foundation, rests upon a very insecure basis indeed. There are very many well-meaning people upon this earth who imagine that it is indispensably necessary for one's salvation to believe that a man called Jesus of Nazareth once lived and died in Palestine. But it would be difficult to give any intelligible reason why the belief in such a historical person should be necessary for that purpose, or in what way such a belief should differ in its results from a belief in Julius Caesar, Aristoteles, or any other person in history, as all opinions in regard to things of which we have no personal experience are merely opinions and constitute no real knowledge. To believe in an event of which we know nothing is to cling to a superstition, even if the event is actually true. We can have no self-knowledge about persons that existed before we were born. But we may, at any time and at every place, realize the presence of the true Savior, the eternal living Christ within ourselves. All attempts to explain intellectually the miracles and deeds attributed to the great Nazarene for the purpose of making it more plausible that they have actually occurred in a literal sense are therefore degrading to religion, and may be looked upon as sacrilege, for they drag spiritual truths down to gross material life. They force sublime ideas into narrow material forms, and destroy the beauty of the ideal by causing it to appear in a vulgar, sensual shape. Even the most exalted virtues with which a poet may endow a personal Savior will never give him that luster which shines around the head of the eternal and impersonal Christ, and all attempts to make the beautiful allegories of the Bible agree with historical facts will be unsuccessful, and even appear ludicrous to the unprejudiced and clear-thinking observer. Gerald Massey says, "The worst foes of the truth have ever been and still are the rationalizers of the myths, such as the Unitarians. They have assumed the human history for Christ as the starting point and accepted the existence of a personal founder of Christianity as the one initial and fundamental fact. They have done their best to harmonize the divinity of the mythos by discharging the supernatural and miraculous element, in order that the narrative may be accepted as history. Thus they have lost the battle from the beginning by fighting it on the wrong ground." Gerald Massey, from The Historical Jesus and Mythical Christ. The question whether or not the doctrines of the Bible are true cannot be decided by answering the question whether or not the events described therein have actually occurred in external life. That proof must be sought in the internal evidence of those doctrines, and this evidence will appear plain enough as soon as they are understood. The vain attempts to prove rationally the possibility of the occurrences of miracles such as are described in the Bible are equally absurd, for the indisputable proof that one single miracle had actually occurred would immediately overthrow the foundation of all religions and destroy the belief in an external and unchanging God. God, being himself the law, or the cause of the law, cannot act against himself without committing suicide. And those who are trying to uphold a belief in the possibility of an anti-natural or absolutely supernatural occurrences are denying that God is the ruler of nature. They degrade him to a fallible being who changes his mind and is subject to whims such as are produced by external influences. But what external influences could possibly act upon God, who is self-existent and omnipresent and who includes the all? The fact that no miracle has ever occurred is the most formidable argument for the existence of a universal God, for it proves the existence of universal and unchangeable law, whose lawgiver must be equally universal and not subject to change. Those, however, who attempt to reconcile the miracles of the Bible with material reason, by seeking to explain them by theories of sleight of hand or by the spiritistic theory, are to be pitied most, for they prove that they have neither faith which characterizes the Christian, nor sufficient intellect to see where the so-called realities end, and where the realm of the fable representing the true ideal begins. From profane history, we can gather very little information in regard to the person of the great reformer. All that we can learn from a few short remarks in Tacitus and Josephus, believed by some to be interpolations, is that some such person actually existed, and we are led to infer that he was regarded by some as a sorcerer, by others as one of the would-be reformers and religious fanatics of those times, that he was opposed to the prevailing religious views, and that on account of the attacks he made upon time-honored institutions, upon which the security of the church and authority of the clergy rested, he was finally put to death. So-called sacred history, as contained in the four Gospels, is believed to give detailed account of his life and his doctrines, but while there seems to be a vein of truth in regard to actual historical occurrences underlying the Gospel accounts, the great bulk of the latter is in contradiction to common sense, and merely a repetition of different allegories, such as we may find in the ancient books of the Egyptians, Persians, and Brahmins. These ancient myths have been most curiously mixed up with the biography of Jesus of Nazareth, and represented as having actually taken place during his life. In fact, the few probable details in regard to the life of Jesus are so much loaded with fables and misinterpreted allegories that the New Testament deserves to be regarded rather as a poem describing psychological processes than as a book of history describing external occurrences. If we examine that book without any prejudice and without any sectarian bias, we may find therein two currents of thought. The first applies to the life of man, who, if he has not been entirely misrepresented, must have been a great genius, a hero, and a reformer. The second current refers to sacred truths, such as were taught in the secret doctrines of the Aryans and Egyptians. Truths which we find stated in the book of Hermes Trismegistus, in the Bhagavad Gita, and others. In these ancient books we find reference made to the Christ principle long before the name of Christianity was known, and the myths of the Immaculate Conception, the Son of God, etc., may be clearly traced to this ancient origin. This discovery, far from throwing discredit upon the veracity of the principles upon which primitive Christianity was based, serves rather to strengthen the foundation upon which the original doctrines rest. It does not overthrow the truths stated in the Bible, but goes to confirm them by showing that the processes thus allegorically described are not merely events of the past, but that they are continually occurring, and will, in all probability, continue to occur in the future. It is usually claimed by those who adhere to a belief in a merely personal and historical Christ that the Gospels were written by the apostles, who, having been disciples of Jesus and eyewitnesses of the miracles he performed, knew what they were talking about. Granting, for argument's sake, that these men had left some written accounts, they cannot be held responsible for all the additions and interpolations which were afterwards made by their followers, and which cannot stand the test of sound reason and logic. It has, however, been proved by recent researches that neither of the four Gospels in their present shape was written by the apostles, but that they were probably collected long afterwards by some unknown members of the church, who labeled them with the names of the apostles, so as to impress upon them the stamp of unquestioned authority, while they undoubtedly eliminated from the existing traditions a great deal that may have appeared prejudicial to the interests of the church or contrary to their own views and opinions. It is not our intention to enter into a discussion in regard to the origin of the Gospels, nor would we expect any great benefit to arise from a controversy in regard to such matters. But in matters of religion, and where no knowledge exists, sentiment forms a stronger attraction than reason. No argument is strong enough to force a person to lose his hold of a favorite opinion to which he has resolved to cling, while those whose knowledge is the result of mere argumentation have usually very little power of spiritually perceiving the truth. Those who cling to time-honored superstitions, as well as those who love skepticism and sophistry, will live on the food they have chosen until they are satisfied with it. What does it matter to us, after all, to know whether or not our ideal Christ has ever existed in history? If we were in a position, or if it were necessary for us to imitate the daily deeds of the man Jesus of Nazareth in all their details, then would it perhaps be important to know whether or not the accounts told of these deeds are literally true? But as we are living in a different age and under different circumstances, we cannot imitate his external life in all its details, but we can look up to him as a high ideal and imitate his inner life, and we may live up to such an ideal without knowing whether or not it has ever been embodied upon this earth. To imitate his thoughts is far more important than imitating his personal acts. If we look at an image of Jehoshua, seen through the trembling mists of incense, mixed with the vapors of human blood and smoke of burning heretics, we see merely an unnatural and distorted image of the Jewish Jehovah, a ghastly-looking shadow that seems to be neither a god nor a man. If we look at him from a rational standpoint and apply to him the rule by which mortals are usually measured, we find that our measure is somewhat too short, for we discover in him a sublimity of character, an unlimited love, a transcendental intelligence, such as is not found combined in one person in the modern history of the world. But if we look at him as being one of the full-grown flowers of humanity, a person whose mind was illuminated by divine wisdom, an adept, who possessed the knowledge of his own higher self, we cannot conceive to him in that light. I think I got ahead of myself. Who possessed the knowledge of his own higher self, all that appears strange and impossible in his character becomes at once clear and comprehensible. But we cannot conceive of him in that light without entering to a certain extent within the mystic realm of occult science, whose key is the power of spiritual perception, called intuition. Looked at in that light, he stands before us as an ideal man and as a personification of wisdom. The standard of morality and spirituality of a people will always depend on the quality and attitude of the ideals they follow. If their ideals are monstrous and unnatural, they will be vicious and lead unnatural lives. If their ideals are true, they will be guided by considerations of truth. The ideal created by the Spanish monks, and which they called their Christ, was a devil, and their deeds were the actions of devils. The standard of morality and spirituality existing among the various Christian churches of the world, including more than 200 Christian sects, may be correctly estimated according to their higher or lower conception of the term Christ. In many cases, we find that conception very narrow, and therefore the doctrines of these sects differ in such cases widely from the doctrines of Christ. The Christ, or Messiah, means the Redeemer, the redeeming power of universal spiritual consciousness, love, and intelligence, while the limited Christ of the churches is merely a person, whose love manifests itself at best only inside the church. The real Christ means universal life, while the Christ of the sects means separateness and favoritism. True Christianity means spiritual enlightenment, universal benevolence, charity, and tolerance. Churchianism means mental darkness, stubborn ignorance, selfishness, intolerance, and self-conceit, and hate for all who will not submit to clerical rule. True religion, such as may perhaps be found in the far distant Golden Age, means that entire reunification and self-sacrifice, such as we find it described in the Bhagavad Gita and in other sacred books of the East, and which is also represented by the ill-understood symbol of the Christian cross. But modern sectarianism, the offspring of the worship of the bloodthirsty Jehovah, is based upon a concentration of all our hopes and aspirations upon the attainment of some selfish personal benefit here or in the hereafter, upon a craving to save that worthless self, even if its salvation were to involve the ruin of the rest of the world. True religion, the power to know and realize spiritual truths, is attained by those who can rise above the sphere of their elusive self. Sectarianism is kept alive and nourished by the love of men for their own animal self and by the fear to lose that beloved thing. As long as this love of self, based upon an entire misconception of the true nature of man, is not eradicated from the heart of mankind and replaced by knowledge, the upas tree of dogmatism will find therein a soil in which to spread its roots and reap temporal benefits for the church at the expense of the eternal welfare of its deluded adherents. In Yehoshua ben Pandira, we behold a divinely inspired man, inspired not by any external personal deity, but by the eternal light of divine wisdom that illumined his mind. We behold in him first a rabbi, a man of great talents, who sought earnestly after the truth, and who, after having been initiated into the Egyptian mysteries, became a prophet and a seer. Having arrived at a knowledge of the truth, he heroically defended it against the priests of the temple and sacrificed his life in an attempt to bring the life of the true Christ that existed within himself to the understanding of the masses. He attempted to dispel the clouds of darkness created by superstition and fear so that the light of spiritual knowledge might enter the hearts of mankind. He taught the principle of universal fraternal love, of a love for the sake of love, not a love on account of expected rewards, but his ideas were too grand, too sublime, to be comprehended by the narrow-minded bigots of his age. He was murdered by those whom he attempted to save, and he, whose whole life effort was directed to overthrow the superstitious belief in a limited God, separated from humanity and subject to whims and caprices, was so little understood by his followers that after his death those who claimed to believe in his teachings made of himself such a limited God, separated him from humanity, and selected him for an object of their external worship. In Jesus of Nazareth we behold a beautiful allegory representing the spiritual gem of divine intelligence in the soul of man, conceived in the heart by the power of the Spirit of divine wisdom, continually born in the mystic Bethlehem, situated in the purest region of the human soul. To speak of him as an historical person is a blasphemy and an absurdity. He never was killed by the Jews, although he is continually crucified by professed Christians. He is alive today and will live forever, and resides in the hearts of those who adore him and obey his commands. Is mankind nowadays better prepared to receive the gospel of the universal saving power of knowledge and love than when Jehoshua lived? Are men ready now to do away with the religion of fear and selfishness and substitute it for the gospel of freedom? Will it now be possible for them to comprehend that their beloved self, to which they cling with the grip of despair, as a drowning man clings to a straw, has no permanent existence at all, but is merely an illusion, a product of continually changing interaction of correlating forces, which, acting within the physical plane, produce that sensation which causes the illusion of isolated existence? Will the pious be ready to believe that before they can hope for any immortality of their individual self, they will first have to begin to live by finding that individual higher self, their Savior, who exists in a life beyond the separation of form? Will they be ready to receive the gospel of eternal and universal life in the Spirit, or will they regard a doctrine which denies the immortality of the lower self as being identical with denying the immortality of the soul? Have men become intelligent and heroic enough to be free, or must they still be furnished with the crutches of hope and fear to enable them to stand upright? Are men now their own masters, or are priestcraft and superstition still necessary evils to keep the ignorant in subjection and terror to make them obey the law? Is a religion which is based upon the love of men for their animal selves, and whose only excuse for existence is its expediency and usefulness for political and social purposes, really useful in the end? Is such a religion calculated to ennoble mankind, or perhaps the cause for the growth of selfishness and its resulting evils be found in that spirit of egotism upon which that religion rests? Will it be practicable now to proclaim truths which have at all times been carefully hidden from the eyes of the ignorant? And if not, should not the truth be told for its own sake and irrespective of any consequences that may result therefrom? Can the knowledge of the truth have any other effect in the end than that of ennobling those who open their eyes to its light, even if the dawn of today will cause a temporary disturbance among the dark mists of ignorance which cover the face of the earth? These important questions seem to be well worthy of our consideration, especially at the present day when the Christian temples all over the world are seen to totter and shake, because they are built upon sand, when the monsters of anarchism, socialism, nihilism, etc., born of ignorance, rear their heads, and tyranny and monopoly, the offspring of selfishness, are vampirizing humanity, when the whole of Europe appears to be threatened by a devastating war, and America is beginning to suffer the ills produced by causes transplanted from the old world to the new. Let me just interject right there. Man, it sounds like we are there right now, doesn't it? And this book was written a long time ago. I want to say this book was written, oh man, early 1900s maybe? Maybe a little later. I'm not really sure. I know it's old though. In regard to so-called science, the age which seems now to be nearing its end has been one of blind materialism. In regard to so-called religion, it has been one of formalism and credulity in supposed historical facts. But it is said that now has the time arrived when one of the seals of the closed book, spoken of in the Bible, is to be opened. That is to say, that the understanding of mankind as a whole will be opened to a comprehension of eternal truths, which for ages past have been misunderstood. The following allegories describe the processes which are taking place within the inner or thought life of all who strive for initiation, and which must have therefore also taken place within the inner life of Jehoshua, if that person was what we may well suppose him to have been, a man illumined by the Spirit of divine wisdom. And that's going to do it for the introduction. Next, we'll get on to Chapter 1, A True History of Christ. And we will catch you at the next reading. Thanks for listening. Take care.